Hey you guys, it's Anita and I have another great video for you today. If you enjoyed my last video where I gave you 4 tips on how to sew with sweater knit, then you'll also enjoy today's video because it's an extension of that one, and I'm going to be giving you 3 tips on how you can sew sweater knit with a serger. I recently sewed this cute sweater knit duster using my Baby Lock Vibrant Serger and I absolutely love it. The serger did a great job on this knit. But before we get into the tips, I want to give you the pattern and fabric information for the duster that I made. I used Simplicity 8648 to sew my duster, and what drew my attention to this pattern is the midriff band with the button closure. I think that is such a cute detail. I sewed view B, but I omitted the ruffle at the bottom and I just extended the length for view A. And I used a sweater knit. Now, the suggestions on the pattern for this particular garment are challis, cotton types, crepe, double georgette, gauze, georgette, linen types, silky types, voile, and lace. Now, if you are a beginner, you're probably wondering, well, why did you sew it with sweater knit? Once you get experience under your belt, then you will gain the confidence to substitute different types of fabrics than what is listed on the suggestions list on the pattern. Because I have a lot of experience sewing, I know how to make those substitutions. Now, because this pattern calls for a woven fabric, it is acceptable to substitute with a knit fabric. However, if you are using a pattern that calls for a knit, you need to stick with a knit fabric because that pattern has been designed for stretch. It's very important that you pay attention to that. Don't try to substitute a woven fabric for a knit. It won't work out, okay? Just thought I'd share that. Now let's get into the tips. Tip number 1, cut a 1-inch seam allowance. When you're cutting your sweater knit fabric, make sure that you extend your seam allowance to 1 inch because the serger does a much better job cutting away larger amounts of fabric. And this is especially important if you're using a super stretchy knit. The last sweater that I made with the off-shoulder style, that was a very stretchy fabric. And if I had sewn that sweater, my main seams with the serger, I would have definitely used a 1-inch seam allowance. If the pattern that you're using calls for a 1/2 inch seam allowance, then add an additional 1/2 inch to make sure that you have 1 inch if you're going to be sewing it on your serger. The pattern I used called for a 5/8 inch seam allowance, so I could have added 3/8 of an inch on all of the edges to give me 1 inch to sew it on the serger. Now, because the fabric I used doesn't have an excessive amount of stretch, I was able to actually sew the garment on the serger with the 5/8 inch seam allowance. So this is the sweater knit fabric that I used to sew my duster, and I purchased it from Michael Levine Fabrics years ago before they closed. It has about 25% stretch crosswise. It has very little stretch lengthwise, which is really good because when the fabric has more stretch lengthwise, then when you're making a garment that has a lot of weight, the weight of that fabric will pull down and cause it to stretch even more. And then diagonally on the bias, it has a little bit more than 25%. So this fabric is excellent for sewing the duster. Tip number 2, use a 4 or 5 thread overlock stitch. A lot of people like to use a 3-thread stitch when serging thicker fabrics because it reduces the amount of bulk on the seam. However, because the sweater knit does tend to ravel more, you need more support. I used a 4-thread overlock on my Baby Lock Vibrant Serger to sew my duster, and all of my seams are very secure. My seam allowances are completely enclosed, so I don't have to worry about my seams falling apart. I can wear this garment for a long time. I can wash it and not have to worry about anything coming apart. And finally, tip number 3, test stitch your fabric. As with any other sewing machine, make sure that you test the stitches on a scrap piece of fabric that you will be using for your garment to make sure that you have the proper stitch for that particular fabric. The last thing you want to do is start sewing on your main fabric cuts on the pieces that you've cut from the pattern and find out that the stitch you've chosen doesn't work for that particular fabric. When you get ready to test your stitches, then you'll need to determine where the 1-inch seam allowance is on your machine. Baby Lock has this amazing attachment that comes with the machine. It's this seam guide. It's an adjustable seam guide, and you can just adjust it to wherever you need it to be for the seam allowance that you're using. As I'm sewing my stitches, this will always keep me in line. When I'm working with sweater knit on a serger, I like to test the stitches in 3 directions. I will test it crosswise, which is perpendicular from the selvage. I'll test the stitch vertically, which is parallel to the selvage. And then I will test it diagonally, which is on the bias. This will give you an idea of how the stitches will perform on the fabric. And when testing your stitches, make sure that you're using 2 layers of fabric, as you will when you're sewing the garment. When you're testing the stitches on your fabric, then you can use your tension dials to make any necessary adjustments to get the stitch that you need for that particular fabric. So you have tension dials for the needles and tension dials for the upper and lower loopers. You can use the manual that came with your serger to learn how to make adjustments to those dials. So look at your manual, find out what adjustments need to be made, and follow the instructions. Sweater knit tends to stretch even more while you're sewing, especially if you're using a sweater knit that has an excessive amount of stretch. Now, I did share tips on how you can prevent your sweater knit from stretching when you're sewing in the last video, but I think it bears repeating here how important it is that you ease your fabric as you are sewing your sweater knit. And the way you can do that is to puddle up the fabric on the sewing machine in front of the presser foot, so that when you start to sew, you will allow the presser foot to feed the fabric through without pulling it across the machine. And as you continue to sew, you see that I'm puddling that fabric up on the machine in front of the presser foot as it feeds through. So first, I'm going to test my stitch crosswise using a clear elastic stabilizer. Now I'm going to test my stitch lengthwise, parallel with the selvage. And finally, I'm going to test the stitch on the bias, because I know that the bias have the most amount of stretch. Now that I've given you 3 tips on how to sew sweater knit on a serger, make sure you go back and watch the last video where I gave you 4 tips on how to sew sweater knit in general. Then you can combine all 7 tips and achieve success when sewing your next sweater knit garment on a serger. Well, that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed this video. If so, please hit the like button down below and leave a comment, because you know I love to engage with you guys. Now I have some footage to show you of me wearing the duster, but don't leave afterwards because I have a special announcement to make. All right, check it out. And now for the big announcement. But first, I want to send a huge shout out and thank you to Baby Lock for sponsoring this video. Also, Baby Lock has made a generous donation. They have given me 1 Vibrant Serger to give away to one of my community members. So if you read my last blog post and you entered the drawing, I have pulled a name and I'm going to be calling that name out right now. And the winner is... Congratulations, congratulations. I am so excited for you, and I know you're gonna love your Vibrant Serger. I will be reaching out to you via the email that you used to subscribe to my private email community and to enter the drawing. For those of you who are not part of my private email community and you would like to join so that you can be a part of these special giveaways and other activities and things I have coming up in 2022, then I have left a link in the description box below this video. You can go and click on that and then join my community. And if you are interested in purchasing a Vibrant Serger for yourself, then I've also left a link in the description box below so that you can go over to the Baby Lock website where you can find a retailer to purchase your Vibrant Serger. It's a great beginner serger. It's a workhorse and I absolutely love it. I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.